February 1957, Cody, Wyoming. Cattle country, hard against the mountains, where the wind off the high country can freeze the breath in a man's chest. It is the noon rush at the Mountain View Café on Sheridan Avenue. Every stool at the counter is full. Ranchers, roadmen, a couple of school teachers, the smell of coffee and frying onions and wet wool. At the far end of the counter sits a man alone. His name is Sam Lindqvist. He is 34 years old, though the lines on his face would tell you older. He came in out of the cold for a cup of coffee and a bowl of soup, the way he does most days, quiet, bothering no one. But something has gone wrong. A truck has backfired out on the street, a sharp, flat crack, and somewhere behind Sam Lindqvist's eyes, the year is no longer 1957, and the place is no longer Cody, Wyoming. His hands have begun to shake. The coffee trembles in the cup. His breath comes short. He is gripping the edge of the counter like a man holding onto the rail of a ship in a storm, trying with everything he has to stay in the room. And the manager of the cafe is coming around the counter, fast, his face twisted with disgust. "Not in here," the manager says, loud enough for every stool to hear. "I told you before, I won't have it. Out, now. You're scaring the customers." He takes Sam Lindqvist by the collar of his coat and steers him toward the door, and the whole cafe watches a shaking man be marched out into the February cold, like a drunk being thrown from a saloon. Nobody at that counter lifts a finger, except one. At a table by the window, a tall man sets down his fork. He's been there the whole time, quiet, broad through the shoulders. He watches the door swing shut on the shaking veteran, and then he stands up. Nobody in the Mountain View Cafe recognizes the tall man yet. By the end of this story, every soul in that room is going to be ashamed of having sat still. Here is the story. To understand the man the cafe threw into the cold, you have to know what he carried. Sam Lindqvist was born in 1922 on a ranch in the Bighorn Basin, the son of a Swedish homesteader and a Crow mother. His grandmother's people had been in that country longer than there was a country, and his grandfather had come from across an ocean to break horses. And Sam grew up between those two worlds, the way such children do, belonging to both, fully welcomed by neither. There was a man who'd taught Sam most of what he knew about horses, an old wrangler named Bill Ironshell, who'd worked the Bighorn outfits for 40 years and had no use for a young hand who couldn't take a hard word. Bill had taken one look at the half-Swedish, half-Crow boy the other men weren't sure what to make of, and he'd said only, "Can you sit a green colt without jerking his mouth?" Sam said he could. Bill said, "Then I don't care what your blood is, show me." That was Sam's whole education in how a good man measures another. Not by where he came from, by whether he could do the work and keep his word. Sam carried that into the war with him, and it was part of what made the war so hard to come home from, because over there, men had measured each other exactly that way, by what they did when it counted, and a man's blood and his back home and all the rest of it fell away to nothing. For a while, in the worst place on earth, Sam Lindqvist had belonged completely, for the first time in his life, to the men beside him. And then they were gone, most of them, and he came home to a country that measured him by how he looked at a lunch counter, and the belonging was over, and the quiet had come. People in Cody knew Sam as a good hand and a man of few words. What they did not know, what almost nobody knew, was that the silent, shaking man at the end of the cafe counter had once carried a wounded boy from his own outfit 2 miles across open ground under fire, and had sat with that boy while he died, and had never spoken of it to a living soul. The town saw a nuisance. The town had no idea it was looking at one of the bravest men in the state of Wyoming. He was 19 when the war came. He went, the way nearly every young man he knew went, and he served in the Pacific in the worst of it, island after island, the kind of fighting that the men who came home could never quite put into words, and mostly never tried. He did his duty. He did more than his duty. He came home in 1945 with a chest he never showed anybody, and a quiet that hadn't been in him before. And then, because the country asked again, he went back for career, older this time, steadier on the outside. But the war stacked itself on top of the war, the way it does, and the second one finished what the first one started. When Sam Lindqvist came home for good in 1953, he was 30 years old, and he was not the same man, and there was no word for what was wrong with him. There is a word now. We call it post-traumatic stress. We understand now that a man's body and mind can be wounded by what they have seen and survived, just as surely as by a bullet, and that those wounds are no kind of weakness, and that the bravest men carry them. We have places to go and people to talk to, and we are, slowly, learning not to be ashamed. In 1957, there was none of that. In 1957, a man like Sam Lindqvist had a few bad names to choose from and not 1 ounce of help. Shell-shocked. Battle-rattled. They figured he was weak, or drinking, or simply broken, and the kindest thing most folks could think to do was look away. A backfiring truck, a slammed door, a sharp word at the wrong moment, and Sam would be somewhere else, somewhere terrible, fighting to get back, and the world around him saw only a grown man shaking and sweating at a lunch counter, and was embarrassed for him, and wished he'd take it elsewhere. He worked when he could, ranch work, the kind that let a man be alone. He kept to himself. He came into town for coffee and supplies, and tried to take up no space at all, and most days he managed, but not every day. And the Mountain View Café had thrown him out before. The manager of the Mountain View Café was a man named Lyle Cruz, and Lyle Cruz was not, by the standards of his time, an especially cruel man. That's the hard part of this story. He wasn't a monster. He was an ordinary man running a busy café who had decided, the way most of the town had decided, that whatever was wrong with Sam Lindqvist was bad for business and not his problem to fix. He'd seen Sam have a spell before. It made the customers nervous. It was, to Lyle Cruz, a nuisance, like a leak in the roof, and he dealt with it the way he'd deal with a leak. Get it out, get it gone, get back to the lunch rush. He never once stopped to think that the shaking man at the end of his counter had crossed 2 oceans and walked into fire for the very people now staring at him over their meatloaf. He never once thought to ask what the man had seen. It simply did not occur to Lyle Cruz that the most heroic person in the Mountain View Café that day was the one he was dragging out by the collar. And here is the part that ought to sit heaviest. The room let him. A full counter of decent people, ranchers and teachers and working men, plenty of them veterans themselves, men who had been over there and knew, who in their own private nights knew exactly what was happening to Sam Lindqvist, sat on their stools and looked at their plates and said nothing. Not because they were bad people, because they were embarrassed, because nobody wanted to be the one to make a scene, because it is the easiest thing in the world, the very easiest thing there is, to decide that someone else's suffering is someone else's business. That was the villain. It wasn't Lyle Cruz, not really. It was a whole country that had sent its sons to 2 wars and then had no idea what to do with the wounds it couldn't see, that had no name for them, no grace for them, no place for them, so it called them shameful and looked away. Sam Lindqvist wasn't being thrown out of a cafe. He was being thrown out by a world that wanted his courage and had no room for his cost. If you've ever carried something nobody could see, a wound, a grief, a hard spell of your own, and had the world turn away from you instead of toward you, then you already understand Sam Lindqvist. And if you've ever been the one in the room who should have stood up and didn't, then you understand the rest of them too. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Your town, your state. I read every one. And if you believe no veteran should ever be thrown into the cold for carrying what we asked him to carry, type 1 word for me down below. Honor. Now, back to that cafe, because the tall man at the window table has just stood up, and he's walking toward the door. The tall man didn't shout at Lyle Cruz. He didn't grab him. He walked past him, out the cafe door, into the cold. Sam Lindqvist was on the sidewalk, leaning against the brick front of the building, his head down, his hands shaking, his breath coming in short, white clouds in the freezing air. A man trying with everything he had to climb back up out of someplace dark and far away, alone, in front of a window full of people who'd watched him go. The tall man didn't say much. That was the thing folks who saw it would remember. He didn't make a speech. He just walked over, slow and easy, and he leaned against the wall right next to Sam, shoulder to shoulder, the way you'd settle in next to a man at a fence rail, close enough to be there, not so close as to crowd a man who'd had enough hands on him already. Cold one, the tall man said. Just that. Easy. Like they were 2 fellows waiting on the same bus. Sam didn't answer. He couldn't, yet. Take your time, the tall man said. I'm in no hurry. Know where I got to be. And he just stood there, steady, a big, calm presence beside a shaking man, asking nothing of him, waiting. Slow, Sam's breathing came back. The shaking eased, the faraway look left his eyes, and the year came back to being 1957, and the place came back to being a cold sidewalk in Cody, Wyoming. He wiped his face with the back of a still trembling hand and looked, for the first time, mortified, bracing for the disgust he'd seen 100 times. It didn't come. "There he is," the tall man said quietly, like he'd just been waiting for a friend to surface. "You all right now?" Sam managed a nod. "Sorry," he got out. It happens. I'm sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for." The tall man said it plain, like a fact, not a kindness. "Where'd you serve?" And maybe it was that question, asked the right way, by a man who clearly meant it, but Sam told him, "The Pacific, then Korea." The tall man listened, and nodded, and didn't flinch, and didn't pity. And when Sam was done, the tall man said something Sam Lindqvist would carry for the rest of his life. "I've known a lot of brave men. The bravest ones I ever knew shook just like that. After. It's not the shaking that tells you what a man is. It's that he keeps getting up and walking back into the cold. You've been getting up a long time, son. That's not weakness. That's about the strongest thing there is." Sam looked at him then, really looked, the way a man looks at someone who has just said the one thing he's needed to hear for 4 years and never expected to. "Most folks," Sam said slowly, "figure I ought to just get over it, put it behind me. They say it like it's a door I won't walk through, like I'm choosing it." The tall man shook his head, slow. "There's no door, son. I knew a man once tried to find that door for years. There isn't one. What there is," he paused, choosing it carefully, "is people. The thing doesn't go away, but it gets a sight lighter when you're not carrying it by yourself in a room full of folks looking the other direction." He looked out at the cold street. The worst part of it was never the shaking. I'd put money on that. The worst part was being alone in a crowd while it happened. Am I right? Sam's eyes filled. He didn't trust his voice, so he just nodded. "Thought so," the tall man said quietly. "Well, you're not alone in this crowd. Not today." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The wind came down Sheridan Avenue and rattled the cafe sign on its chains. Inside the window behind them, the lunch crowd had gone quiet, watching the tall stranger stand in the cold beside the man they'd all just watched be thrown out. And some of them, the veterans among them especially, were beginning to feel something turn over in their chests that they would not be able to put down for a long while after. "I'm going to ask you to do a hard thing now," the tall man said. "Harder than you think. I'm going to ask you to walk back in there with me. Head up. Because the worst thing you could do, the thing that had let every one of them off the hook, is slink off home and let them feel relieved you're gone." He held out his hand. "Don't let them off that easy. Come have a hot meal." Now here is where the easy version of this story would have the tall man storm back inside and knock Lyle Cruz flat. That's not what happened. Because the tall man understood that decking a cafe manager would have made Sam Lindqvist a spectacle all over again, would have made the day about a fight instead of about a man's dignity. So he did something harder and quieter and far more powerful. He opened the cafe door, and he held it, and he walked Sam Lindqvist back into the Mountain View Cafe, back into the full lunch counter, past every stool of people who'd looked away, and he sat down beside him at a table by the window, in front of all of them, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The cafe had gone dead silent. Lyle Cruz started over, flustered. "Sir, I don't think... that man, he..." The tall man looked up at him. He still didn't raise his voice. He never did, the whole time. But something in how he looked at Lyle Cruz stopped the man cold. "This man," the tall man said, slow and clear enough for the whole silent room to hear, "went where you and I didn't have the guts to go, twice, so that you could run your cafe in peace. He came in here cold and hurting, and you put your hands on him and threw him into the street." He let that sit a moment. "Now you're going to bring him the best hot meal in this place, and you're going to bring me the same, and you're going to treat this man, every day he walks in here for the rest of his life, like exactly what he is, which is a better man than anybody who sat still and watched." He paused. "Can you do that?" Lyle Cruz looked around his own cafe, at the faces of his own customers who would not meet his eye now, because the tall man had just said out loud the thing every one of them had been too ashamed to say to themselves. "Yes, sir," Lyle Cruz said quietly. "I can." Now stop and think about what the tall man actually did, because it was more than buying a man lunch. He could have thrown a punch, he could have made a scene, shamed Lyle Cruz, played the hero, people would have cheered. Instead, he sat down. He put himself in front of a whole judging room, shoulder to shoulder, with the man everyone else was ashamed of. And by sitting there, calm and unhurried, and proud to be in that man's company, he told the entire café, without a single insult, that they had it exactly backwards. That the shaking man wasn't the disgrace, the looking away was. That's the difference between rescuing a man and restoring him. You can rescue a man with your fists. You can only restore him by sitting down beside him, where everyone can see, and treating him like he's worth sitting beside. Stay with me. Because the reason that tall man was in a cafe in Cody, Wyoming, on a freezing day in 1957, and the reason he knew, the very moment that truck backfired, exactly what was happening to Sam Lindqvist, doesn't come clear for almost 60 years. They ate their meal, the two of them, at the table by the window. The tall man talked easy, about horses, about the high country, about nothing in particular. And slowly the noise of the cafe came back, and the customers went back to their lunches, quieter than before, a good many of them turning something over in their hearts. When it was done, the tall man paid for both meals, and he left a tip that made the waitress's eyes go wide, and he took the cafe ticket and wrote something on the back of it and pressed it into Sam Lindqvist's hand, folded. "Don't read it till I've gone," he said, "and keep coming in here. This is your place now, same as anybody's. You hear?" Sam nodded, his throat too tight for words. The tall man put on his hat, clapped Sam once, gently, on the shoulder, and went out into the cold. By the time Sam unfolded the ticket and read what was on the back, the tall man's car was already pulling away down Sheridan Avenue, and the snow was already beginning to fill the tracks. On the back of that cafe ticket, in a steady hand, were just a few words. Sam Lindqvist would carry that folded ticket in his breast pocket for the rest of his life. He'd touch it through his shirt on the bad days, the way some men touch a medal or a cross, and it would help. The Mountain View Cafe was never the same after that day, and neither was Cody. Word got around, the way it does in a small town, of what the tall stranger had said and done, and the town looked at itself a little. Lyle Cruz, to his lasting credit, was as good as his word, better than his word. He kept a stool at the end of the counter that the regulars came to know was Sam's, and on a bad spell day, he'd quietly pour Sam a coffee and tell the other customers to mind their own business. And once or twice, he was seen to stand beside Sam against the wall outside, shoulder to shoulder, the way the tall man had, until the spell passed. People can learn. That's the hope in this story. People can be ashamed, and then be better. Sam Lindqvist kept coming in. He was never cured. There was no curing it, not then. But he was no longer alone with it, and that, it turned out, was nearly as good. A man can carry almost anything if the people around him will help him carry it, instead of throwing him into the cold. For years, folks in Cody wondered about the tall stranger, who he was, why he'd been there, and most of all, how he'd known. Because that was the thing nobody could explain. The moment that truck backfired, and Sam's hands started to shake, before Lyle Cruz had even come around the counter, the tall man at the window had already set down his fork, already known, like he'd seen it before, like he'd been waiting, half his life, for the chance to do something about it. He had. The tall man had a brother, not by blood, by war. A man he'd been close to, once, long ago, who'd come home from his own war carrying the same invisible wounds Sam Lindqvist carried. And the tall man, when he was younger and didn't understand, had not known how to help him, had been embarrassed sometimes by the shaking and the spells, had, once to his shame, looked away in a public place when his friend needed him to look toward, had been one of the people on the stools, just the once, and had regretted it every day since. And his friend had not made it. The wounds nobody could see had taken him, the way they took too many, quietly, alone, with no name and no help, and no one sitting down beside him. The tall man never forgot it. He never forgave himself for the time he looked away, and he made a quiet promise, the kind a man makes to a grave, that he would never sit still again. That wherever he found a man shaking and alone, with a room full of people looking away, he would be the one who stood up. He would be, for some other man, the friend he hadn't managed to be in time. That's why he was already on his feet before Lyle Cruz reached the end of the counter. That's how he knew. He hadn't just recognized Sam Lindqvist's spell. He'd recognized the whole terrible scene and his own old place in it, and this time he refused to play it. Sam Lindqvist lived another 31 years. He married, late, a widow named Alma who ran the dry goods store and who had a gift for sitting quiet beside a person without needing anything from them. They never had children of their own, but Alma had a daughter, and Sam raised that girl as his own, and loved her, and was loved back. The folded cafe ticket stayed in his breast pocket through all of it. It was that girl's daughter, Sam's granddaughter, in every way that mattered, who carried the story furthest. Her name was Grace. Grace grew up hearing about the tall stranger who sat down beside her grandfather when the whole world had turned away, and she grew up watching her grandfather, on his hard days, touch that folded ticket through his shirt. And she grew up understanding young that there were wounds you couldn't see, and that the cure for them, as much as there was one, was somebody willing to sit down beside you. Grace became a doctor, a psychiatrist. She went to work for the Veterans Administration, and she spent her whole career doing the thing the world had no idea how to do in 1957, sitting down beside shaking men and listening, and telling them what a tall stranger had once told her grandfather, that it's not the shaking that tells you what a man is, it's that he keeps getting up. She became one of the country's leading specialists in combat trauma. She helped write the protocols. She trained a generation of doctors to look toward the wounded instead of away. Grace gave a lecture once to a hall full of young doctors just starting their training, and she did not begin it with science. She began it with a café. She told them about a February day in 1957 and a backfiring truck and a shaking man at the end of a counter and a room full of decent people looking at their plates. She told them about a stranger who didn't throw a punch and didn't make a speech, who simply walked outside and leaned against a cold brick wall and said, "Take your time, I'm in no hurry." Everything I am going to teach you about treating combat trauma, Grace told that silent hall, every protocol, every medication, every therapy, all of it is just an attempt to do, in a clinical way, what that stranger did on a sidewalk with no training at all. To stand beside a suffering person without flinching, to make them not alone in the crowd. The medicine matters, but if you ever forget that the medicine is only there to deliver that one human thing, the willingness to sit down beside someone the world is ashamed of, then you will be a worse doctor than a cafe manager who learned to do it by being shamed into it. Be the one who sits down. That's the whole job. The rest is detail. She told them her grandfather had carried a folded cafe ticket in his breast pocket for 31 years, and that on it a stranger had written 4 words: "You kept getting up." That, she said, is the entire treatment plan. Everything else is how we help them keep getting up. Now open your books. The young doctors never forgot it. Some of them are practicing still, sitting down beside shaking men and women in VA hospitals all over the country, because of a cafe in Cody and a stranger who refused to look away. Untold numbers of veterans got their lives back, in part because a man got thrown out of a cafe in 1957 and a stranger sat down beside him. Sam Lindqvist passed in 1988, 66 years old, with Alma beside him and the folded ticket in his pocket, where they left it, because none of them could bear to take it from him. To the end of his days, Sam never knew the tall stranger's name for certain, though in his later years, watching a picture on the television, he'd sometimes go very still, and Alma would catch him touching his breast pocket. He kept one more thing of that day, besides the ticket. The chipped white coffee cup the cafe had served him that afternoon. Lyle Cruz had given it to him, years later, when the cafe finally closed, because by then, everyone understood it was Sam's cup. And a few weeks after the stranger's visit, all those years before, a small package had come to Sam with no return address. Inside was a sealed envelope, marked in a steady hand, to be opened by the family of the man from the cafe in Cody. They kept it sealed, honoring the words. It passed from Sam to Alma to Grace, and waited, unopened, for decades. And it was Grace, the VA psychiatrist, the one who'd given her life to sitting down beside the wounded, who finally opened that envelope in the year 2016. Inside was a single sheet of paper, in the same steady hand as the words on the envelope and the words on the back of that old cafe ticket. It said that the writer had once had a friend, a good man, who came home from war with wounds nobody could see, and that the writer had been young and foolish and ashamed, and had looked away when he should have looked toward, and that his friend had not made it, and the writer had carried that for the rest of his life. It said, "I did not do a great thing in that café. I bought a man a hot meal and I sat down beside him. Any decent person could have done it, and the shame of my life is that once I was the one who didn't. I have tried ever since to be the man I failed to be for my friend. That fellow in Cody owed me nothing, and I gave him nothing he hadn't earned 10 times over on 2 oceans. If his family ever reads this, tell them only that their man was brave, braver than the room, braver than me. The shaking was never the weakness, the looking away was. I know because I once did the looking away, and I have spent a long life trying to make up for it. And it was signed, not with the name the world knew from the screen, but the way a man signs when he wants to be remembered just as plainly himself. Marion Robert Morrison." Grace set the letter down with her hand over her mouth, because she knew that name. Anyone of her grandfather's generation knew it. Marion Robert Morrison was the name John Wayne was born with, the name on his birth certificate, before Hollywood ever gave him the other one. The tall stranger who'd stood up in a Cody café, who knew, the instant a truck backfired, exactly what was happening to a shaking man, because he'd once failed a friend the same way and refused to ever fail another, was the Duke. Today, that chipped white coffee cup and the folded café ticket Sam Lindqvist carried for 31 years sit together in a glass case at the Park County Museum, donated by Grace along with the letter. The ticket is turned so you can read what the stranger wrote on the back of it that cold afternoon. It says, in a steady hand, "You kept getting up. That's the whole of it. Keep going in. A friend." The placard tells the story of Sam Lindqvist, soldier, ranch hand, a brave man who carried what could not be seen, and of the stranger who sat down beside him. It does not name the stranger. That was his own wish, written plain in the letter. He never wanted his name on it. He never wanted credit for a thing he believed he was only doing to make up for a kindness he once failed to give. But now you know. There is, somewhere near you tonight, a person carrying something you cannot see. Shaking, maybe, on the inside where it doesn't show. And there will come a moment, there always does, when the easy thing is to look away, and the hard thing, the brave thing, is to walk over and lean against the wall beside them and say, "Take your time, I'm in no hurry. Know where I've got to be. Be the one who sits down." They don't make men like John Wayne anymore, and they don't make men like Sam Lindqvist anymore either. The ones who keep getting up and walking back into the cold and never once telling you what it costs them. If this story moved you, do one thing in their memory. Share it with a veteran or with anyone who's ever carried a wound you couldn't see, and tell them you're glad they keep getting up. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I read every one. And hit subscribe. There's a new John Wayne story here every night at midnight. And down below, type the one word that means no one who served should ever be thrown into the cold for what they carry. Type it for Sam Lindqvist and for every man who keeps getting up. Honor.